Feeling guilty, something so many of us suffer from so much of the time. Hi, I'm Suskin, and today I want to talk about a topic which is so familiar to so many of us, and I think something that all of us need to think about a little bit more before we enmesh ourselves in the trap of guilt and what it leads to. Guilt, really, perhaps one of the most common issues I see in my practice as an astrologer, is something that, at least at the one level that I want to talk about it, is something that astrology itself can help us understand. You know, for example, my episode on sacrifice, I spoke a lot about what the great masters had to say about sacrifice. And while I will share one or two things that others have said about guilt, where I really want to come from today is the fact that astrology, in its very balanced way of understanding human nature, helps us understand the consequences of guilt when it's not appropriate to be guilty. I mean, is it ever appropriate to be guilty? If you understand the meaning of the word guilt in terms of a dictionary, yes, then it is sometimes appropriate to be guilty. So we want to talk about all those other times. Before I go there, how does astrology help us with that? Well, one of the things astrology does is that it links things together that often don't appear to be linked. So the particular issue that I very often see in people's astrological charts is that people who suffer from guilt often end up making sacrifices, whether those sacrifices are for other people or to some more abstract, well, then I have to live my life this way, or something like that. And so it's because of astrology's very clear take on the matter of sacrifice that we can actually understand guilt a little bit as well. So this particular angle on guilt, which I think will relate to many of you, starts off, as I said, with a proper understanding of what does guilt actually mean. I mean, I once said the word guilt to a lawyer and she said, "You mean culpa?" Fault. I am responsible for something. The English word guilt comes from the Old English word which means crime. So guilt is essentially a legal term which refers to one being responsible for the crime or being literally responsible for something. Responsible for what? Well, it's interesting when you see how guilt is applied. I mean, guilt as we know it, a feeling that is similar to or perhaps leads to shame, is understood to have essentially evolved to control aggression and violence. So it definitely is part of the idea of responsibility for action and responsibility for aggression and violence or so on. Indeed, could be culpa, guilt in a court of law. But essentially, in that kind of evolutionary setting, guilt evolved in order to function as a means of social control. And you can see that very clearly in the behavior of, say, parents who make their children feel guilty of something, or much more commonly, religion, which makes people feel guilty of a whole bunch of things. So when people feel guilt in response to religious edicts or religious rules or something like that, the function of guilt is to control the behavior of the individual so that it will conform with that of the group. So it then goes beyond where it started. That clearly is the function of law as well. Law and the obeying of laws helps us helps control society. It's a form of social control, and certainly it is about making people conform to the group. But the magical word crime disappears when you take it out of the legal context. In fact, it can be misapplied. So some people, in response to religion, can feel as if they have actually committed a crime, be it against their God, against their religion, or against some structure like that. So the actual literalness of the crime gets a little bit more blurred, and the importance of the social control becomes much stronger. And of course, it's the way that parents are making use of that social control, making the child feel responsible for something as a way of controlling the child. Certainly, children need to be taught responsibility, but guilt has that blurry line of something that is either beyond me, bigger than me, or outside of my control is my fault in some way. Again, to remind you, we're not speaking of guilt when you actually do something that is perhaps reprehensible or that you think that it is, that then actually does need some consequences. We're not talking about the crime of guilt. We're saying the whole problem is that when guilt is taken out of the context of crime or something similar to the court of law, it becomes this blurry method of social control that can have other consequences, one of which is shame, the emotion we experience when we feel we've been exposed to the public or to the masses for our guilt. Guilt is the emotion we feel ourselves, where we feel this deep sense of personal responsibility that often, as I see in my astrological practice, dramatically undermines people's sense of their own value. Their self-worth is dramatically affected by that. Gary Zukav has described guilt as a manipulative way of seeking forgiveness. He takes another angle on it, and he says, on the one hand, it is about social control. So the religion or the society controls us by making us feel guilty of something. It's probable that that guilty feeling is going to lead to something like making a sacrifice or some other self-undermining behavior. But Zukav says, don't be so sure it's just that. Look to yourself. Often, he says, guilt is a manipulative way of seeking forgiveness. He says it is the belief that if you inflict suffering on yourself for your choices, another will forgive you for them. Isn't that an interesting thought? It is the belief that if you inflict suffering on yourself for your choices, another will forgive you for them. So he takes it one step further and says, well, if you look to yourself, you can see that guilt is also a form of manipulation. So not all, and as we're seeing that there's a range of behaviors and possibilities that lead to guilt and that lead us to behave in a certain way. So we either experience shame, we experience we experience sacrifice, or we experience manipulation to try and get others to forgive us. Very common. You'll see it around you all the time. You'll see it in your own behavior, where we deliberately take on guilt so that other people will say, no, it's okay. It's not your fault. You couldn't have done anything about it. While those things might be true, as Zukav says, they also are a form of manipulation because you're trying to get forgiveness. Guilt, because it means I've committed a crime, requires either punishment or forgiveness. If you're feeling guilty with respect to God or something abstract, how do you get any forgiveness? Easiest way is to get it from other people. So what do? We conform to the desired social behavior, and then by exposing our own suffering, try and get the forgiveness of others. Zukav is suggesting that we haven't really solved the problem of guilt when we do that, because we're reinforcing the whole notion that it is a form of social control and that it does control us. Because for me, I always think, the one step further than that for me, and some of you are going to find this a little bit challenging, but this is what I think, is that I have seen a movement in the last couple of decades, which is not new. It's existed on and off probably even for thousands of years, whereby people interpret their physical illnesses as related to spiritual states, also to emotional states, but related to these non-physical states, to the extreme of the idea that every single thing that ever happens with your body is related to some spiritual issue. Something made very popular by Louise Hay, for example, but it is a very old idea that comes from before that. And it struck me as a big problem when I met with a friend of mine who was suffering from cancer. And she understood that she had caused this cancer through her wrong thinking. She didn't, as she said it, she didn't think correctly about spirit or God or the universe or the earth or being the right way. And although she couldn't identify it, as far as she knew, she really always did the right thing. And she did do her meditations, and she did do her be good to other people or whatever her principles were. And yet she still got cancer. And so she could only blame herself. I must have done something wrong. I must have thought something wrong, even if I didn't know that I was thinking that. She felt such tremendous guilt that once she broke to that guilt, her decline was rapid and her death was not long after that. Now, I'm not saying that guilt was responsible for her death, although I could go there, because it certainly seemed to me it was responsible for her decline. Guilt is a destructive emotion. It destroys us because it denies us our individual behavior, and it makes us manipulate other people or make unnecessary sacrifices. So it's so wrapped up with shame that she felt ashamed that she had caused her own illness. She felt that I must be spiritually wrong. I'm a bad person. I must have done something wrong in order to make me sick this way. So whether or not cancers or other illnesses are related to emotional states is not the debate that I'm going to have here today. The least I will say is, as we know, there are many different causes for all sorts of illnesses. There isn't usually one cause for something or one possibility for something. There might be many possibilities. So perhaps that is a possibility. But this overall thing that says I am entirely responsible for my body and whatever it does leads to shame. I mean, one of the greatest experiences of guilt and shame has to do with the body. We shame each other about the body because we have this societal rule that says you should look in a particular way, you should dress in a particular way. And if you don't do those things, the force of society tries to make you conform. And as I said early on, the way that we experience that force is through the feeling of guilt. But the emotional consequences of that guilt can be enormous. So someone who is made to feel shame, even indirectly, because of their weight or some other aspect of their appearance, actually experiences greater self-destructiveness. And so the best option is to try and manipulate the others to forgive them. And so you have that perpetual cycle, and which, in the case of the body, supports huge industries, be they diet industries or therapy industries or whatever the case may be. And it denies any other possibility for either what is the body situation, or that it's okay to look like that, or that there might be some other individual reason for that. So in the end, Fred Weaver put it this way, that shaming people in that way and making them feel guilty, especially about their body, disconnects them from their individual expression. And as he says it, reattaches us to the social and survival needs of the family and society. Listen to that again. Feeling guilty disconnects us from our individual expression and reattaches us to the social and survival needs of the family and society. Bottom line, it denies the individuality and says the only way that you can be is through whatever following the rules entails. And that's why you can have this concept of body shaming or clothes, even judging people by what they wear, all of which say your individuality is denied. The consequences of that can be huge and ongoing, and either lead to great levels of self-destructiveness or to levels of manipulation and an ongoing cycle. So you can have the idea that in a family or society, someone can actually accept that role. I am the guilty one. I'm the one who always gains weight or doesn't conform or dresses the wrong way or always causes the trouble. So the family or the society responds to the shaming behavior, the creation of guilt, all of that. The guilty person responds by saying, mea culpa, I am at fault, it's my fault, feels shame, and then asks for forgiveness. The forgiveness is received, the person is welcomed back into the circle, and the behavior can repeat itself. And so the system is maintaining itself like that. And so some people are these outsiders who are destined to carry the shame and the guilt and whatever consequences may ensue. For some people, as I've shown you, some of that consequence can be huge. And for people who are taking personal responsibility for things that are not personally responsible, that they are not personally responsible for, like many illnesses, it can even lead to death. So that's a really interesting thought. But the main thought that I really want you to get from that is the way that guilt detaches us from our individuality and connects us with the needs of the greater in a way that leads to us having to take fault or shame and admit that we are wrong to be different. We are wrong to be individual. What is the crime that you're guilty of when you're experiencing guilt? The crime that you are guilty of is being yourself. Sometimes what the crime of guilt leads to is us making sacrifices. So we give up something like our individuality or dressing that way or our particular intention or something else in order to appease the other. Sometimes we make sacrifices in order to acquire the social status or the individual status that guilt has removed from us. So we feel guilty, whether it's to the kids or to the partner or to some other person. We make a sacrifice, meaning we give something up, and that allows us to rejoin the whole. But we lose when giving something up. The word sacrifice comes from the Latin word sacer, which means holy. And sacrifice is meant to be a spiritual act where we want something greater than ourselves from the gods or from God. People making sacrifices of fruits or goats in biblical times or in other cultures at other times are really trying to say to the divine, here, take something precious of mine and give me something back that I can't get from the earth, whether it's forgiveness or some kind of spiritual enlightenment or something that they can't get and the divine can provide for them. So there really was a transaction, and sacrifice was a way of taking responsibility or losing something in order to gain something. So we see that behavior emulated in our behavior when we feel guilty. We make a sacrifice and we hope to gain something back from the society or from the people. I won't dress this way. I won't do this. I'm wrong. I'll give something up, and maybe in return I'll get forgiveness. But we don't, because sacrifice means to make sacred. So it means the only way you can get a return from sacrifice is from the divine, from the gods, from something ineffable. From the world, we lose when we give up something, because the world isn't going to give you anything back for nothing. It's not how it happens. All we get in the situation of guilt is some kind of social acceptance. I mean, with so much suffering in the world, with so much inequality in the world, how do you not experience guilt? How do you accept the limitations of what you're able to do or of what you're responsible for doing? So all of us are going to feel some kind of guilt, and then that guilt is used to shame people into making sacrifices for which they get nothing in return. And again, sacrifice, you're meant to get some kind of spiritual elevation or upliftment or something like that in return. In the end, we feel guilty that we are not being the person we are supposed to be. And in the end, guilt is a form of self-denial, lack of acceptance of the self, giving the individual and the self up for the sake of the greater, and seeking something from them that we cannot get. And so the cycle is perpetuated. What is the bottom line then? there are two things that you can concentrate on to try and manage that guilt situation. Firstly, a good way to press your own button when you're experiencing guilt is to ask yourself the question, what is my crime? If I went to a judge of a court of law and said, this is what happened, would I be convicted of a crime? And if the answer is no, then you've got to say to yourself, perhaps guilt is the inappropriate thing to be feeling right now. Maybe I need to look at this another way. Sure, it's easier said than done, but it gets you to step yourself out of yourself in that guilty situation and say, another way to do it is, am I trying to manipulate the situation by feeling guilty? Am I responding to their manipulation by manipulating the situation to get forgiveness? I don't need forgiveness if I didn't do anything wrong. So keep on taking it back to, did I do something wrong that a court of law would recognize I did something wrong? Something to think about. And in the case of sacrifice, to think about, am I doing this to the gods or is this to another human being? Do I get something in return that only God could give me, or am I actually losing in some way? So simply ask yourself, in what way is this a spiritual act? Sometimes I think, if we make sacrifices for our children or our parents or those obvious karmic relationships, well, then perhaps it is a spiritual act. But like most of your guilty reactions, most of your sacrifice behaviors are actually not appropriate and will lead to you losing out in the process. So just a thought. Sometimes we are guilty and sometimes sacrifice is called for. But if we step outside of ourselves and ask yourself, is this about me having to lose or give up my individuality? And anything about your body is that. That can be a really sharp question for you to take control back, to say this is my body and my behavior and my action, and it's an expression of my individuality. And in that way, not my body that I make it ill and I make it better, because I don't think that's really what's going on there. But to say this is me and all I can be is me. So for me, when we say that all those other things affect us, that if I were following some kind of spiritual path, then my body would be beautiful and fine, and I'd never get ill and I'd always be perfect, is just buying into that very same form of social control that says, if you follow the rules, you will be fine. And if you don't follow the rules, you'll only have yourself to blame if anything goes wrong. So take back yourself, take back your body, take back your flawed individuality, because flawed individuality is a lot better of an emotion than guilt, which leads to shame, sacrifice, and manipulation. And time just quickly for one of your questions. I've received a question from Sandy this week saying that business has not been going well for quite some time. She wants to know, is this the right business and can she expect any financial improvement in the coming months? Thanks for your question, Sandy. Firstly, to say that without knowing what the business is, I can't be sure that this is the right business for you or not. But looking at how your chart is working, it's very clear to see that there has been a long time of difficulty and there isn't any clear sign of that changing. It does look like in the time ahead, you are going to continue to struggle with it. I would assume from the chart, without knowing what business it is, that this does not look like the right business. Your chart says in some way you're deluded or you've got an illusion about it. You're seeing it the wrong way. You're not seeing it for what it really is. There might be a solution in facing reality types of things. But quite frankly, it really means perhaps you're in the wrong zone and this is not quite the place to be because it isn't what you want or it isn't what you need. Indeed, actually, it's the very configuration that makes us think you're making unnecessary sacrifices. You'll be starting to feel guilt and responsibility for something that you're not actually responsible for. Might be your own business, but that doesn't mean you can completely control its destiny, and might be time to actually let go a little bit of that. There can be some financial improvement in October, but it's not clear from the chart that that will be ongoing, and by next year you might still feel as if you're in the same situation. So Sandy, it might be time to really reflect on it, to look at Am I holding on to it for the wrong reasons? Look at the issues of guilt, shame, and sacrifice. Disown those, and then see if you think, I'm ready to give up this business or change it enough so that it's a different business. So maybe in that sense, it's time to move on, or it's time for something else. Remember, you can always send me your questions, be they personal questions, cosmic questions, anything you want to know, including show suggestions. You can also find out about my astrology course. You can make personal appointments, any kind of contact you want to make with me. And remember to join me again next Friday, 12 noon on YouTube. We'll be back with another episode.